Okay, 2 people in the chat. 3 people in the chat are reporting that we are live. And so, let us start again from the top. And I apologize for the problem. So, welcome to Digital Forth's panel on understanding fusion centers. Digital Forth is a civil liberties organization in the Massachusetts area, and we are the local affiliate of Restore the Forth, who are providing technical support for this panel. First, I would like to welcome our panelists. We have an amazing set of panelists for you this spooky evening. We have journalist Emma Best of DDoS Secrets, who has reported extensively on fusion centers. We have Danny Hargis of BU Law, who has written an excellent report on the workings of the fusion center in Austin, Texas. And we have Councillor Ricardo Arroyo of Boston, who will be addressing some of the efforts that there have been in Boston to understand and regulate the Boston area fusion center. With that, because we have less time than we were thinking we would have, I would like to go straight to Emma to explain what we currently know regarding fusion centers and their operations. Take it away, Emma.
Hi. So I'm going to try and speed through this. Currently, there are 80 DHS recognized fusion centers, but in addition to that, there are a number of fusion centers operating in the US that are not DHS recognized. That means that DHS just doesn't have any involvement in them, but they are part of law enforcement operations. Typically, there are some fusion centers or things that we would essentially call fusion centers that are entirely corporate run, and in at least one instance, a religious fusion center. Their purpose ostensibly is to share information, and this sounds great, but their mission is ill-refined, and in practice what it means is they are a little more than a cesspool of information and an endless email forwarding chain. In many instances, they will pass on information that is not properly vetted. In more than one instance, when they've been confronted with this, such as with information that they were caught passing on, I think after Blue Leaks specifically, which DDoS Secrets published, and challenged about, this was very bad intelligence, why were you passing this on? They defended it by saying, it's our job to pass on the information, it's not our job to vet it. It was submitted properly, and that in itself is disturbing. And Fusion Center's operations are further extended by a series of partnerships, public-private partnerships that DHS and similar groups have that allow more information sharing outside the traditional Fusion Center networks. This is not technically what we would call a Fusion Center, but it is an extension of it. It follows the exact same pattern. It allows the same information exchange, and it follows the same problematic issues. Going through my notes real quick, because again, I'm trying to speed through this, sorry.
It's okay. We don't have a firm ending time, so take the time that you need.
Thank you. One instance that stood out, um, we had uh, corporate executives being given intelligence on activists by fusion centers from Maine. Um, and this included targeting Black Lives Matter activists and passing on rumors and unsubstantiated claims from far right activists and actors, uh, which is problematic in itself and is literally just fusion centers becoming tools of the far right and being used to attack activists and First Amendment activities, which becomes even more problematic when you get into the fact that multiple fusion centers around the country have been caught tracking protester activities. Um, Being asked to speak up or turn up my speaker, try and lean a little bit closer to the microphone. I'm sorry, I'm dealing with just the iPad here. Um, Sorry, where was I? First Amendment activities being tracked. Yes. For instance, the North California Regional Intelligence Center, the NICRIC, um, that's how it's pronounced, uh, sent out daily reports on protests to, I think, over 14,000 police officers. Um, and when confronted with this, the explanation was that it was to protect the protesters. Um, they were unable to explain how they were protecting the protesters, and of course, this happened during the height of the George Floyd protests. And you see similar activity at many other fusion centers and information sharing hubs where they'll engage in Google alerts for things like protests and police brutality. And I'm sure it's for the exact same reason of protecting the protesters. And that's why they pass on this bad intelligence from far right, you know. Anyway, uh, we've also caught them passing on information that is labeled as inaccurate. In one very notable instance, FBI, through fusion centers, passed on a bulletin warning of anti-fascists and leftists paying protesters to cause riots, citing a protest jobs website. The day by the time the bulletin was issued, the website had a big red banner on it labeling it as fake, as satirical. Um, the FBI still issued the the bulletin, but even more egregiously, numerous fusion centers just uncritically circulated the bulletin to numerous officers throughout their states and throughout their regions, which, like I said, it's an email chain. That's what the fusion centers are. And even when they come to defend themselves, because this happened earlier this year, the Maine Information Analysis Center faced a bill, the first serious challenge to uh, defund and abolish a fusion center. Um, they had to defend themselves, and as part of this, they had to list what they had accomplished. And what they listed in their testimony was laughable. Um, for instance, looking very briefly at their list, the recovery of cell phones that were stolen, um, issued a bulletin for a local suspect, assisted a state law enforcement agency with identity theft, monthly compilation of bulletins. These are all things that do not require fusion centers, which are billed as anti-terrorism tools. they're in fact unable to point to any serious success with what they are supposedly required to do. They were created in the wake of 9/11. They exist under the purview of DHS. This is a DHS recognized fusion center. You go through their files and it's all redundancy and nonsense. There's nothing there except disinformation. These fusion centers, they labeled a TikToker a terrorist because she showed a tweet from a Daily Show correspondent. This is the quality of reporting that the fusion centers are putting out. This is the fusion centers operations. I don't know how else to explain it.
I think that's a great explanation, Emma, and we appreciate it very much. One of the strange things about fusion centers is that we are used to a picture of government surveillance where the government is using hyper advanced technology to drill down into our genuinely inmost thoughts and feelings. And in some ways, the fusion centers are not that. They're sort of they are using disturbing and invasive techniques to form a very bad and inaccurate picture of stuff that isn't really going on or should be taken seriously, and then spreading it out.
I was just going to say they're using technology that is capable of that sort of thing, but they're doing it in the latest and most incompetent way possible, where there's no actual analysis or review of it done, so that you get the worst possible results, and it's useless for the goals that they want, and it prevents no harm, it only creates harm, and it still manages to invade everyone's privacy. It's a nightmare on everyone's end, and it wastes every cent that is spent on it.
Well, I think that is a great segue into a close analysis of a particular fusion center. Um, and so I would like now, if possible, to call on Danny to talk about the research work that she did into the Austin Fusion Center with her and her co authors. So take it away, Danny.
All right, thank you, everybody. So my name is Danny Hargis, and today I will be discussing the practices and the scope and the implications created by the Austin Regional Intelligence Center, or ARIC, which is a fusion center in Austin, Texas. So ARIC was created in 2010, and it is one of 8 Department of Homeland Security fusion centers in Texas that's currently active, and it's principally overseen by the Austin Police Department. So it is very clearly a law enforcement um, agency or organization. And its mission, like many fusion centers, is purportedly to protect the local public from criminal and terrorist activity. But following the 2020 BlueLeaks hack, grassroots leadership was able to assemble a report in 2021 that exposes just how much wider ARIC's functioning goes beyond criminal activity. So in reality, ARIC monitors and profiles a wide array of communities and individuals using intrusive technology, and then shares this data with government agencies that weaponize the information to conduct surveillance and arrest. So everything that Emma was just speaking about. So the 2021 Grassroots Leadership Report has the following key findings regarding ARIC's activity. So ARIC collects data derived from social media accounts, phone records, license plates, driver's license records, financial records, utility records, and school incident reports. And ARIC collects this information in 4 very distinct ways. So first, it contracts with commercial database corporations that catalog and disseminate personal information to ARIC. These companies include ones like Dataminr, which provides social media data, formerly Vigilant Solutions, which enables ARIC to track people's location through license plate data, And although ERIC is no longer contracting with Vigilant, it has now obtained a LexisNexis real-time contract, which basically includes all of the same location data. The second method that ERIC uses to collect information is by training over 1,400 liaison officers, 300 of which currently are private citizens, who report suspicious activity that is then shared across the network. These officers often surveil individuals at protests and cultural events like the ones Emma was speaking, including Black Lives Matter demonstrations and Juneteenth celebrations throughout the summer of 2020. These officers are at animal rights events and women's marches and pro-choice rallies and even local high school student demonstrations, among others in the Austin area. The third method that ERIC uses to collect its data is through school police departments at local high schools and community colleges in the Austin area. And these officers essentially profile non-citizen students and students of color based on arbitrary determinations of gang affiliation, and then pass this data on to the state gang database through ARIC. And when I say that these determinations of gang affiliation are arbitrary, I mean that evidence of gang affiliation might only come from a student wearing a gang's designated colors or being seen in an area where gangs are known to frequent, or knowing or being related to somebody who's known to be in a gang, or throwing up a hand signal in a picture that's part of mainstream culture, like a peace sign. And then the evidence or the record of membership in a gang database heightens that student's risk of being targeted by an ICE raid, being detained, being denied immigration relief, being arrested, or even if they are non-citizen, being deported. So extremely serious consequences for these individuals.
Then it might be worth observing here that these problems with gang databasing do extend across the country. And we'll be getting to some of the problems in Boston on that in a moment. And there are also problems with gang definition, as with the incident in Arizona where the Phoenix PD declared that ACAB must be a gang because there were lots of people protesting on the street wearing ACAB or saying ACAB, and therefore it's a gang.
Absolutely. This is a really rampant issue across the country, and Austin is just one place where it really is an epidemic. And ARIC is a huge facilitator of that. And lastly, ARIC also uses city agencies such as Austin Energy to gather personal information of vulnerable Austin residents. So they'll gather utility billing info on gas and electric usage. And then that kind of enables ARIC and government agencies to track those individuals. So in total, ARIC has about 20 regional partners that contribute to its data collection. So it is an extremely vast network.
Can you talk a little bit to the role of community volunteers who assist ARIC? I forget the exact term for what ARIC calls them.
Yes, the liaison officers. Yeah, so there's about, again, 300 of them are private citizens. And I can give some accounts of stories where these officers have really contributed to ARIC's data collection. They can be basically just private citizens who enlist to support ARIC, and because they're private citizens, they could really be anywhere. And the second that they overhear something or film something going on that they deem to be suspicious or indicative of criminal activity in some way, that information is directly fed into ARIC. So a really scary example of that in practice is a story that we have from the Grassroots Leadership Report, where basically a father was mailing a package of toys to his children in Lebanon at a post office, and he essentially was getting into a discussion with the clerk at the post office about how there aren't zip codes in Lebanon, and there was some confusion over that because the post office was requiring a zip code, and he was trying to explain that Lebanon doesn't use zip codes, so he couldn't give one. And he's just trying to mail this package of toys to his kids and to his family over in Lebanon. And basically, he's unaware that a couple feet behind him in line is one of these liaison officers who's just a private citizen informant standing a few feet behind him. And the informant starts to film the interaction. Um, and basically, based on this man's accent and the way he was raising his voice when speaking about the postal address discussion, the informant deemed him to be a suspicious Middle Eastern person who is suspected of terrorist activity because he was refusing to provide personal information for mailing a package to Lebanon. And now this man is on a watch list through ARIC. So it is very insidious and widespread what these officers can do.
That's really interesting, Danny. Thank you. I'd like to bring this this discussion of gang databasing and watch listing over to somebody who I know knows plenty about it. But Councillor Arroyo, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And perhaps you can talk a little bit about the challenges relating to that in Boston and with BRIC.
Absolutely. So I'm a city councilor in Boston. I've been there since my first term is wrapping. We actually have an election on Tuesday. And so I'll hopefully be able to stay on for the extent of this entire conversation, but I may have to leave to another commitment at some point. But in terms of the gang database, this has been sort of the bane of our existence for a little bit over here. I was a public defender before I became a city councilor. And so in Essex County and Suffolk County is largely where the BRIC, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, does its work. And the gang database is a Boston product. And so the gang database here works off of a point system. It's pretty insidious in the way that it works, because what it does is it says, hey, here we have a group of friends, possibly even relatives, cousins, neighbors, playing basketball in a park. And what they'll write is what they call a FIO, or a field interrogatory. And the issue with that is the FIO is sort of like a stop and frisk. Sometimes it is actually a stop and a frisk. Sometimes it is a visual report. In other words, they watch you, they track you, they record the interaction, and then they say this is what happened. The problem with that is that there's no confirmation that they're actually tracking who they think they're tracking. There are cases where you might have a mistaken identity situation where you see somebody who may look like somebody else. We had a video of that go viral once with Zach Crossan, where it was covered by Saturday Night Live and The Daily Show, where somebody was walking, coming from a haircut, and they were sort of hassling and calling them by the wrong name, saying, hey, where are you going? So if that's happening to that level, what's to say when an officer is watching somebody in a park, they're not marking down somebody who isn't that person? What makes the gang database a little bit insidious is that it's sort of like a pyramid scheme in the sense that it's sort of multi-marketing, right? So like if you're next to somebody who is allegedly a gang associate or a gang member, that's a point. If you wear clothing, that's a point, a specific kind of clothing, like an Indians hat or a New York Yankees hat, or if you wear a Houston Astros hat, that might represent some gang.
To be fair, if you're in Boston and you're wearing a New York Yankees hat, that is an act of terrorism.
Yeah, it's an act of war. But basically, it's flimsy. You used to get more points for being a victim of gang violence than you would if you were a self-identified gang member. And so what happens is they created this database that you cannot leave. You cannot ever exit this gang database. The gang database sort of self-populates itself, because if I say you're a gang associate and then I see you hanging out with somebody else who might go to school with you, might take the same bus, might take a school bus or the same public transportation, or you work in the same place, or you play or hang out with the same people, well, now you're getting points. And once you get points and you reach a certain level, now you are capable of giving other people points because you're hanging out with those folks. So what ends up happening is sort of this centralized problem where if I'm saying this street or this area is gang affiliated, then pretty much everybody in that vicinity who is of a certain age is going to end up getting points and ending up as a gang associate on this list. The list is pretty extensive. There was I believe it was the ACLU that received the sort of definition of a gang by BRIC standards. A definition of a gang by BRIC standards is 3 or more people. So you can have a 3-person gang. There were 169 individual gangs on their list. To put that in context, the population in the city of Boston is about 650 to 700,000 people, give or take. It might be a little bit more because of census undercounts. The population in Chicago is about 3 times that amount. Chicago's, I believe, had something like 61 gangs. So according to the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, even though Boston has a much lower violent crime rate, much lower actual square footage and population size, they somehow had 3 times the amount of gangs as a place like Chicago. The issue with places like Chicago's gang database or San Francisco's gang database is we've seen these issues where they've had children on there. They've had people who have been deceased on there. They have all kinds of problems with maintaining their own lists that show that this isn't a very careful process. The issue that we have, that I've had as a public defender, is when you write a faulty police report, and there's sort of, this is the issue I had, and I put straight to BRIC, because we're allowed as counselors to sort of have them in for hearings. We know for a fact, it's not an argument, it's fact. We know that test-lying exists, and that's when an officer goes into a courtroom, lies on the record, and essentially perjures themselves in the interest of furthering a case. We also know that false police reports exist. We've seen that everywhere. However, the reason we can find those things is often because we have an adversarial criminal justice system, which means if you write a false police report, you're filing that police report. I'm receiving that police report in some amount of real time, usually a month, maybe a day. It's coming at a certain time, within a certain time frame, and I can challenge what's in that report. I could say, look, they say I'm here, I wasn't there because I was here, and you can get the video, or you can get these witnesses, or you can find these things. And that's how we find lying false police reports, and that's how we find test-lying. That's how that happens, because the evidence is, we're able to confront them with the evidence of that report. The FIOs, they're private. So in other words, I'm tallying, I say I see Steve at the park with a gang affiliate. Nobody knows if that's actually true or not. I just put that on a card somewhere. I file this report. I say that he was here at this time with a gang affiliate. There's no check on that. There's no check and balance on that. That happens enough times. Now you're a gang associate, a gang member. There's no check on any of those events. So when you show up to court and they're saying this person is a gang associate, that might be the very first time, and I've had clients who this was the case for, that they had ever heard that they were on a gang database or that they were associated with some gang. And basically at that point, it's impossible to go back and say, hey, 5, 6, 7 years ago, were you at, Clifford Park with some person? Because you can't challenge that the same way. So it lends itself to sort of abuse. And when you have a system where we know that Boston police officers have filed false reports, we know that they've filed false overtime sheets, we know they've committed fraud in all these different ways, it doesn't stand to reason that the only infallible thing that we have is these FIO reports. Basically, yes, we've lied on our overtime sheets, which is a crime, and we've been prosecuted for that. We've lied under oath, which is a crime, and we've been prosecuted. Well, we haven't been prosecuted for that, but we've been caught doing that. We've written false police reports, which is a crime, and we've gotten away with that. It doesn't make sense that the FIOs are somehow sacred and that they're not being falsified in some way, shape, or form. So you end up with this gang database that is 98% Black or Latino. The way that they try to play with those numbers, because they recognize that that is a striking number, about 70-something% of the FIOs are Black or Latino in the city of Boston. To put that in perspective, the entire Black population in Boston is about 18 to 20%. So you're over policing specific segments of the community, and to put all that in perspective, what they've started to do is they'll say white, Black, and what they mean when they say white is I would be white on their sheet. I would be white Hispanic, and for journalists who don't do the work on this, the way they've tried to hide their numbers is they'll say, well, actually, it's about 55% or so Black, and it's like 30-something% white. But if you go look at the next thing next to white, it'll say white Hispanic, because what they're doing is they're hiding the fact that the Latino population, somebody like me, might check the white box on their sheets, because that's how they've set it up. So there's certain things like that they've done. we've tried to rein in the gang database. One of the major issues with the BRIC in the Boston Regional Intelligence Center is that they're fueled and paid for largely by the federal government. I think overall in our city budget, to put this into contrast, the Boston Police Department receives about $400 million from us. BRIC receives something like $4 million. So we're certainly not funding them, and that's by design. Because we're not their main source of funding, we don't have the ability to just shut down the things we don't like that they do, because they get their funding from the Department of Homeland Security for the most part. There's some state funding in there. But what we have been able to do most recently, away and apart from the gang database, is we've been able to create oversight on their surveillance. And so we banned facial recognition technology in the city of Boston. I think we're the largest city. That's probably changed now, but we were the largest city at the time to have done that. And literally just this Thursday, we signed into law the surveillance oversight package. The reason that was a big deal is we've had surveillance oversight in Cambridge and we've had it in Somerville. But what was happening is Boston Regional Intelligence Center would just say, okay, well, because the purchase is being initiated and made out of Boston, we don't actually have to participate in the surveillance oversight for this particular purchase with Cambridge or Somerville, even if the surveillance is being used in those municipalities. Now Boston is requiring them to give us the aforementioned notice of this, because what we know, and I think most folks here know, but I certainly knew as a public defender, is that the technology has far outpaced our policing of it. We haven't actually, the protections in place for where we've gotten with technology are just not keeping up. And so what this does is it requires them to say, hey, we're doing this new social media surveillance thing, which they've done in the past, by the way. I'm using a real thing they did. They spent something like $2 to $3 million on a social media surveillance tool that did not work and that they stopped using on their own. But they spent that kind of money and they did all of that on their own. And it got found out in a different, like, it wasn't like they reported it. It was found out by a FOIA request. And so these are the kinds of things that they would now have to present to us and say, can we access this? Can we purchase this? Can we make this purchase? So they have to say, this is the surveillance technology we're trying to use. This is what we intend to use it for. This is the cost. That's brand new. They've never had to do that. And that allows the council, which is 13 members in the city of Boston, to vote no or yes on something, which would only require 7 votes to say, no, that's surveillance. That's pushing the line. That's not effective. You're not proving that that's something that would be effective or wouldn't be abused. Or 7 could say, yes, that's something we can do. But it takes those purchases and it takes that surveillance out of the shadows where it's been, where they make these decisions in some room somewhere and they don't tell anybody and they just use it and utilize it, and brings it to the public light where we can have a public conversation about it and folks can be informed about exactly what kind of equipment is being utilized and what kind of equipment is being attempted to be purchased. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to grasp and put our hands around. I do believe, and I should check into this, I don't know this to be a fact, but we have a mayor's race in Boston. I believe Michelle Wu is on record as being opposed to the gang database. I believe Anissa Sabi-George is not in opposition to the gang database. But these are the kinds of things where structurally we have to get to dismantling, because the gang database is a racist tool. And what I have talked to folks about on this is there's nothing else that we police that way. There's no narco trafficante list. There's no mafia list like this. There's no database that we create where somebody is in contact with somebody else. It only seems to occur when we're talking about crimes that they believe involve policing Black or Latino youth. And that's an issue that we really have to get to in terms of how we reform policing in general, but also how we reform methods of surveillance and methods of control. And that's what these really are. And so that's hopefully a brief oversight of that can lends itself to questions or however we go into that. I don't want to dominate too much of the time, but those are the two things. So the gang database is run out of the BRIC database, is run out of the Boston Regional Intelligence Center. And so is sort of the surveillance and the methods of which they use to surveil. And it's an interesting song and dance because the Boston Regional Intelligence Center is run by the Boston Police Department, but is treated as sort of a separate entity.
Thank you very much, Councillor Arroyo. And we appreciate hearing your perspective We can see on this, and with what we have been hearing from Danny and Emma, that there are common elements here to the practices of different fusion centers. That there is surveillance of activists, that there is systematic surveillance of people of color, um, and and observing that, I'd like to open the session up to Q&A. We're getting a few questions in the live chat, and the first one relates back to something that Danny was referring to, and talking about these threat liaison officers. What do we know about the mechanisms by which people become threat liaison officers? What is the process? Is it just police recruiting friends, or is it police recruiting vulnerable people? What do we know about what's going on there? And if Danny could take that first, and then anyone else is welcome to chime in on the panel.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's not one that grassroots leadership couldn't really explore too much in our report. From what I understand, it sounds like they're kind of just general supporters of police or law enforcement, maybe people who would be part of like a neighborhood watch program or something along those lines. But I don't have any confirmed answer as to who they are. But it's a great question, and we can certainly look into it and maybe publish an answer to that following the recording. Alex?
Mm-hmm. Emma, was there anything that came up in the context of Blue Leaks that might throw light on that question?
Nothing specific in Blue Leaks, but in general, when I've seen things like that in the past, people like that tend to very much fall in they like to see something and say something, and especially the problematic reporters that we see, like the people that would report someone for, saying things that sounded Arabic and wearing a turban, which I think was one of the more problematic reports that made the news. Um, you know, those are just patriotic Karens that want to call the manager, and the biggest manager they can think of is a cop. Um, they see a sign somewhere, or they Google, they Google terrorist alert, and they come up with, the local regional intelligence center. I don't have anything firm on that, but that's generally the pattern that I've noticed with similar things.
That's helpful. Thank you to both of you for that. One topic that has come up in the chats is people trying to understand the extent of how this intelligence collection by fusion centers bleeds into active harassment of individuals, whether those individuals are activists or gang affiliated or for other reasons. And so, what have you seen in your research or in your experiences? And this goes to any of the panelists, that that is suggestive of there being patterns of harassment of presumably non-criminal individuals.
So there aren't so much patterns of actual harassment. Certainly not, the targeted individual type of harassment that I think people might be asking about. But you do see instances of, like one notable thing that was in Blue Leaks was an author who was critical of, I think it was the railways. It was an environmental reporter, and they were talking about problems that can come up, and the negative impacts that can happen. And basically the companies that they were reporting on and being critical of were slipping the feds information and talking about how the reporting could basically incite criminal activity as a result of people becoming upset by it, and criminal protests could result from this lawful and accurate reporting. And so you do see some instances of indirect harassment like that, where people are, you know, doing journalism, they're doing activism, and, you know, they're clearly being targeted in some way, but it's more like the deck is just being stacked against them a little bit. It's not so much that anyone is actively harassing them. It's more that the deck is actively being stacked against them. And I'm very aware that that is a very fine distinction that in many instances doesn't matter. But it is also an important distinction to make. It doesn't make it any more okay, but that is the sort of thing that I've seen in the documents.
I think that what we have seen, and we've been engaged in activism against the Boston Regional Intelligence Center since 2013, is we have seen a case where a journalist who was reporting on the security arrangements at and around the finish line of the Boston Marathon was designated as a security threat and was harassed at checkpoints. And we know this because the BRICS geospatial intelligence analysis people went and boasted about doing this at a conference, and had a screenshot in their presentation of their geospatial intelligence collection that included the report on the journalist and also a stray remark of 2 Middle Eastern males acting suspiciously, which I think sets the general tenor for the kind of security threats that they were interested in. We also have a more recent case of a documentary filmmaker and their circle being substantially harassed by a BRIC agent, who may have taken a dislike to them because the filmmaker won a lawsuit against Donald Trump. But there has been some ongoing harassment there. But as with much relating to fusion centers, it's unclear how much of this results from policy and how much results from an initial arrogant assumption that they're okay with getting up into people's lives and trying to catch them out. We also see a comment from Sue Udry in the chat, and I should note that Sue is the executive director of Defending Rights and Dissent, a civil liberties organization. But she notes that the FBI coerces people to be informants, often under threats of being deported. And she is curious to know if coercion to be an informant is part of fusion center practices as well. And one might extend that out by asking a little bit about what is the differentiation between what the FBI does to harass people into being informants and what the fusion centers do to harass people into being informants. There may be a little duplication there. So would anyone like to address that as a topic on the panel?
Well, fusion centers are generally less likely to recruit informants in the traditional sense. simply because they're not investigatory agencies the way the FBI is. Um, the liaison officer program, while notable and alarming, is kind of as far as they usually go in that regard. And they usually just tend to pass that on to others. They don't do a lot with it, they don't work sources over. Um, they fusion centers usually lack the resources to handle human long term the way a state police force or the FBI would. So no, I don't think the fusion centers are pressuring people into being informants the way the FBI sometimes does. And if they do, I think they immediately hand it over to someone else, or they're doing it while working with these other agencies, because they literally wouldn't know what to do with the person once they had them in their pocket. Um, that said, sure, they're violating their rights in plenty of other ways.
There's an interesting question from Julie in the chat, and this one I think is for Ricardo. Do we know how many Boston police officers are employed by BRIC and whether they're full time? And do we know whether BRIC itself has these threat liaison officers?
What was that last part of that question? About the liaisons?
Do we know whether BRIC itself has these threat liaison officers who are members of the public who are volunteering to provide them information?
So I do not know that to be the case. And actually, this is why the BPD's involvement with the Boston Regional Intelligence Center is kind of interesting, in the sense that it sort of masks the size of it. So the Boston Regional Intelligence Center does not have that many employees. It's actually a pretty small shop. You're probably talking about somewhere between 30-ish employees. However, the FIOs, the field interrogation and observations, those are done by regular Boston Police Department people. So regular Boston police officers on the job. There's about 2,000 of those that can go out and take these observations and make these observations, and then they send that information to the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, who then sifts through all of that and sort of creates these databases. The other thing is that the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, some of these videos that directly line up to BPD directly line up to BRIC. So any of these surveillance videos that BPD has access to, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center usually has access to. And so the reality is there's a big fusion in how they do their services and how they practice their services, which gets us back to sort of the gang database is sort of a failure, even in a practical sense. The reason that they want this to exist, right? If you want to put your police hat on and figure out why would this make sense, because it's a gang database and it sounds interesting. Basically, the idea that was relayed to us through Boston Regional Intelligence Center is that the gang database's purpose is, let's say there's a shooting on a street, and on that street, they have marked that as gang territory. They have also marked in their database who the rival gangs, in their opinion, are. That's information that they would have gotten from regular Boston police officers fed up the chain to them. The problem with that is almost any investigator or person will tell you that starting with the basis of an idea of why something happened or who did something closes off all kinds of investigation techniques and things you should be doing. So in other words, if there's a shooting on one street and I say, well, this must be gang related, and these are the two gangs which are rivals with this gang, so it must have been one of them, case closed, then you're not necessarily doing the work you have to do. You're just narrowing sort of arbitrarily who the suspects could be, and it's actually not conducive. But when I asked BRIC, which I have, it's on video, I've asked them specifically, can you show any case where definitively the Boston gang database solved or in any way, shape, or form helped solve a crime? And the answer was no, they can't. That's not something that they've ever tracked. So they can't actually show an instance where the gang database was instrumental in solving a murder or solving a major crime. And so essentially, it's a database that prejudices folks. If there's a shooting on this street and I assume that you're a gang member from a rival gang, then you're likely going to get targeted. You're likely going to now be a suspect in this case over here, and you might have nothing to do with it. And it's based entirely off of a gang database that might not even rightfully have you as a gang member on that gang database. It's a broken tool. It's not helpful for what we do, and it's probably why a large percentage of our quote unquote gang involved shootings go unsolved. I mean, we have this has been a long issue for a very long time, but we've had sort of if you Google Boston police and murder solve rates, it's one of the lowest in the country. And there's a lot of people who place blame one place or another. For a very long time, they were blaming the community. But the reality is that these tools that they've used throughout that entire time have not worked for the purpose that they allegedly were created for. And so what they've really done is create a situation where when violence occurs in one neighborhood, it immediately makes other people suspects. And the reason why the staffing is such a tricky thing is that Boston Regional Intelligence Center is in such close contact and conversation with BPD that essentially BPD is just a branch of BRIC in some ways, because they're doing all of the observation, because they're the ones taking this information and then putting it into practice in how they do their jobs. And so even though they're a small shop, what they do and how it impacts what BPD does means that essentially they're sort of one of the same in many, many different areas.
And they're physically co-located as well.
They're physically co-located.
Talking a little bit more broadly about problematical streams of information, I can see some concerns in the chat relating to things like the Citizen app and Ring doorbells and Nextdoor and Neighborhood Watch. Is information from those sources being routed systematically into fusion centers, or is it more done in a more localized and disorganized way? And what might be the implications of using that kind of information on the part of fusion centers and police departments?
And so this question specifically, and I think the journalists might have a better idea, but this question is specifically the Ring camera video, is that going directly to like regional centers?
That is one part of that, yes.
Yeah, so I know for a fact, what I can say is for a fact, I know that the Boston Police Department does do sweeps of streets. So if there's a crime or something occurs, they'll go house to house looking to see if there's Ring camera footage or whatever Blink footage, whatever you're using, Nest, Google Nest. They'll look for those folks to and they'll ask them if they have any footage and if they'll turn that over. So it's certainly something that they're aware exists. It's certainly something that they've been asking for. I do not know if there's a direct feed or if that video then gets sent to the Boston Regional Intelligence Center. So I don't know what the pipeline goes from, but what I can tell you is they are certainly on the ground as a part of their regular day-to-day investigations on things of that nature. They are seeking out that video.
Emma, it seemed like you had a thought on this also.
Yeah, they don't have like a live feed of it or anything, but it's something that they regularly request access to. It's something they regularly get access to, and there's a reason why they partner with Amazon. The police partner with these companies to encourage the sale of these devices and get them installed so much. That said, they also have some paranoia of Ring cameras being used to give people early tip-offs of police raids. So, while take it for what it's worth. They're a little bit afraid of the cameras, but they mostly love them. And right now, there's no direct feed. There's no machine that's being fed by all of the cameras, but they sure would love it if there was one.
There has not been a question specifically on this, but it might be useful to highlight um, suspicious activity reporting. We've talked a little bit about FIOs, but to characterize for our audience what suspicious activity reports are and how they would differ from a report of criminal activity, and the worry that that might pose. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I can talk about that specifically.
Mhm.
Actually, if you're watching this and you want to see what an FIO looks like as opposed to a police report, we have a resource here called Woke Windows. If you just Google Woke Windows, WOKE Windows, you will find all a database of police reports, FIOs, motor vehicle citation stops, and you can actually read them. And so before we did our BRIC database, gang database hearing, I went through there to go find FIOs. And what you'll find is they do things that a police report would never do. So, for instance, if you get a police report, and I've read hundreds of these things, they'll usually.
Hold on a moment, Ricardo.
Yep.
I'm not speaking of police reports as such. I'm speaking of suspicious activity reports, or SARS,
Yes.
which are produced internally to fusion centers and which are not made public.
Are you thinking about FIOs, or are you
No.
thinking about anything on that?
No, I'm talking about SARS, or suspicious activity reports.
Oh, so I don't. That is not my bag. So if somebody else has that information,
that is fine. Danny, did you come across enough information while looking at the Austin Center to be able to characterize what SARS are?
Sure. So I know less about the logistics of what the report looks like, but I can speak to kind of the scope of review that's allowed. And it's basically exceptionally broad, like what is allowed to go into a suspicious activity report, because the ARIC privacy policy, its language is just so sweeping. It basically just says that ARIC is allowed to collect any information that might be useful to administer justice and public safety. And the term useful is not defined anywhere within the privacy policy, so it really just grants considerable discretion in terms of what is allowed to come in, and there really aren't many accountability mechanisms built in to make sure that that is that what's coming in is actually suspicious or indicative of criminal activity at all. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but that is the information that I have.
In terms of some public records work that we did, we certainly found that the Boston Fusion Center was collecting suspicious activity reports that included a category of online threats, a category of suspicious photography. It was what they called pre-unlawful activity, but activity that they felt, if left unchecked and unmonitored, would potentially lead to criminal activity, which then presumably they would have to refer to the FBI. So there were cases of, a guy going to photograph a piece of public art, but doing so from a standpoint where the police considered it to be a sensitive area, and there ended up being a suspicious activity report on that person, or a person who decided to photograph the takeoff of airplanes from the local airport, and it was because they were interested in airplanes, but that was classed as suspicious activity, and there was a report from them. I do recall that some years ago there was a leak of suspicious activity reports in Northern California as well from is it NCRIC? Say, Emma, you gave us the correct pronunciation.
NCRIC.
Sorry?
I think it's NCRIC.
NCRIC. And that suggested that suspicious activity reporting contained a great deal of unverified racially motivated gossip. So they're collecting these files, and without having meaningful external review of what goes into it, or a process for purging that information out in reasonable time. And this seems to us to be a constitutional violation that they are doing. yes, there's a comment that says you can only get a suspicious activity report if it's used in discovery in a case, which may well be so. The last question that I have in the chat relates really to security measures that journalists or individuals could take. There is a reference to the Tails operating system, which is more secure than other operating systems. But more broadly than that, are there reasonable measures that activists or that people who might be unfairly tagged as being gang members might be able to take to not be fed into this system and chewed up by it? Other than by organizing to shut them down, of course, which we would warmly support.
I think as far as the gang database goes, the answer to that is no, because part of the problem with the gang database is, when if you have a police report, it usually means that there's going to be charges filed, and then you get a chance to respond to that in a court of law with an attorney and with discovery processes and all these things. With an FIO, you can have several of those, or every single one of them, frankly, and you'll never know. You would never know. And so FIOs that I pulled out had somebody who went to a laundromat, and they said he goes to this laundromat, and MS-13 has been seen around this laundromat. And so this person must be affiliated to MS-13, because otherwise they wouldn't be using this laundromat to do their laundry. And so that kind of a report gets fed into a system, and you would never know it happened. And then what ends up occurring when we had this sort of hearing, what they said is, well, you could always send a letter to BRIC and say, I believe I am improperly on your gang database. Can you take me off? The problem with that is, who would do that? Who would randomly write a letter and say, I don't know if I'm on your gang database, but please remove me. I'm not a gang member. That's a wild prospect. How would you even know that you've been surveilled, that you're on a gang database? And then why would you reach out to the folks that are surveilling you and improperly profiling you in that way in the first place and expect to trust that process? And so, no, because all of that is in private, because all of that is in secret, there's no method of a person knowingly being on that list, being able to remove themselves from that list. Usually the first time you would ever find out you're on that list is in a court of law. And I'll just make one distinction between immigration court and criminal court. In criminal court, it's on the government to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that report is true. And so there's a burden there on the government. When you're in immigration court, the burden is actually on the defendant to prove that it is false. And so when they come in with a gang database report that says you're a gang member, the onus is now suddenly on this person who may for the very first time be hearing they're a gang member to actually say and prove, no, I am not. And it is incredibly difficult to prove that. And so when you have a system like this in place, it does harm without giving you the ability to actually fight it in advance or beforehand. So really dismantling the gang database is the only real way to prevent that kind of harm. There's no other method or way to protect yourself from that. Unfortunately, there's no other method to do that.
Emma, do you have any thoughts on appropriate security for activists and other targeted people that may be helpful? And I know it's a huge topic.
Make sure you're using Signal, make sure you're using Wire, make sure you're using end-to-end encryption for everything. Tor browser is your friend. Don't assume that just because things can be defeated that they will be. Don't make things easy for people. I know it's easy to go, oh, well, this can be defeated, so it will be. It's useless because FBI can break this encryption, or they can hack into this phone. So why bother? You should still bother. Trust me. You should still bother. And don't use Facebook. Don't use WhatsApp. Use Signal. Make your friends use Signal. Use it for everything, not just for protesting or organizing. even if it's just to talk about the latest episode of whatever you're watching, use Signal. For the love of God, use Signal.
Or at least for the love of the people you're working with.
Yeah.
With that, I would like to start bringing this to a close, but to say that on the part of Digital Fourth, we do want to shut down the fusion centers and we do need help. We would like to form a group of volunteers on this particular project who would set up meetings with legislators and educate them on fusion centers, because fusion centers are not well known. And if you would be willing to be a part of that, then please drop your contact information in the chat, or you can email digitalfourth@protonmail.com if you don't want to put your contact information in the chat. We are very eager to move forward with this, and we feel that there is progress that is being made, both in terms of people having a greater awareness of the kinds of things these centers are doing and a greater willingness to push back on their activities. Are there any final comments from any of our panelists before we go to adjourning? Well, then I would like to thank very deeply all of you for taking time, and on a night on a Halloween weekend, to listen and to be panelists here. To Councillor Ricardo Arroyo, to Danny Hargis and Emma Best, thank you very much in particular for investing the time. And thank you to Sarvesh, who is handling the technical side on behalf of Restore the Fourth. Have a great evening, everyone, and happy Halloween.
Thank you.